On January 10, 2000, a man walked up to a podium in New York and announced he was about to buy one of the largest media companies on earth, not with cash, not with a loan, with stock, with paper that 18 months later would be worth almost nothing. His name was Steve Case, and the company he ran sold dial-up internet access for $19.95 a month. The company he was buying owned CNN, HBO, Warner Brothers, Time Magazine, and Sports Illustrated. And yet, under the terms of the deal, his shareholders would end up owning 55% of the combined company, more than half, while the people who actually owned CNN and HBO and Warner Brothers were left holding 45%. Case stood in that room and said this merger would launch the next internet revolution. What he did not say, because he did not need to, was that he had just traded a mountain of imaginary money for a mountain of real assets, and that within 3 years, the write-down on that trade would become the single largest annual loss any company in American history had ever reported. This is not a story about a dial-up service that got beaten by broadband. Dial-up losing to broadband was inevitable, and everyone in that room already knew it was coming. This is a story about what happens when a company realizes its own stock price has become more valuable than anything it actually does, and decides to spend that valuation before anyone notices it isn't real. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how AOL turned a subscription business into a $226 billion valuation, how it used that number to buy a company built on things you could actually touch, and how the entire trade collapsed so completely that 10 months ago, this year, the very last dial-up modem AOL ever operated made its final connection sound and went silent forever. AOL did not begin as an internet company, because in 1983, there was no internet company to be. It began as Control Video Corporation, a small outfit founded by a promoter named William von Meister, whose one product was a service called GameLine, a way for owners of the Atari 2600 to dial up over a phone line and rent video games for $1 a play. It was a strange, fragile business, and by early 1983, it was nearly bankrupt. That year, 2 men joined who did not yet know they were about to build one of the biggest companies in the world. Steve Case came in as a marketing consultant, hired on his brother's recommendation. Jim Kimsey came in as a manufacturing consultant, brought in by an old Army friend to try to save a company that looked unsavable. Von Meister was gone by early 1985. Kimsey took what was left of Control Video and in May of that year founded a new company from the wreckage, calling it Quantum Computer Services. He put himself in as chief executive and made Case his understudy, promoting him again and again through the late 80s until, in 1991, Kimsey retired and handed Case the company outright. By then, it already had a new name. In 1989, after a short-lived partnership with Apple fell apart, Quantum renamed its dial-up service America Online. Nobody in that boardroom in 1985 was building an internet giant. They were rebuilding a company that had already failed once, and the man who would eventually spin it into the biggest merger in history was, at the start, just the marketing guy. What made AOL an empire was not technology, it was saturation. Under marketing chief Jan Brandt, AOL ran the most aggressive direct mail campaign in the history of American business. Floppy disks, then CD-ROMs, offering free trial hours that kept climbing, from 100 hours to 1,000, were stuffed into magazines, taped to cereal boxes, slipped into video rental cases, and mailed directly into hundreds of millions of households. At the campaign's peak, half of every CD manufactured anywhere on Earth carried the AOL logo. A new subscriber joined roughly every 6 seconds. In December of 1996, AOL switched from hourly billing to a flat $19.95 a month. And so many people tried to log on at once that the whole network buckled into a wall of busy signals, forcing Steve Case to appear in an apology commercial, promising the company was working day and night to fix it. 5 months later, AOL spun off its internal chat feature into a standalone product called AOL Instant Messenger, and an entire generation of teenagers built their first digital identity around a screen name, a buddy list, and an away message. In 1998, AOL bought the web browser Netscape for $4.2 billion. By the turn of the millennium, AOL had more than 20 million subscribers. The voice greeting them with "Welcome and you've got mail" had become a cultural sound, as recognizable as a dial tone. And the company's stock had pushed its total value to roughly $226 billion. It was, on paper, one of the most valuable companies in America. On January 10, 2000, Steve Case made the decision that would define the entire second half of this story. He offered to buy Time Warner outright in an all-stock deal worth somewhere between $162 and $182 billion, depending on which day's stock price you used, forming a combined company valued at roughly $350 billion, the largest merger in American corporate history. The mechanics of the deal revealed exactly what was happening. Time Warner shareholders would receive 1.5 new shares for every share they held. AOL shareholders would swap theirs 1 for 1. Do the math, and it meant AOL's shareholders would own 55% of the new company, and Time Warner's the remaining 45%, even though Time Warner supplied virtually everything the combined company would actually produce: CNN, HBO, Warner Brothers Films, Time Magazine, Sports Illustrated, Warner Music. Case openly admitted, on the day of the announcement, that AOL would contribute only about 20% of the merged company's earnings in its first year, despite holding the majority stake. He became chairman of the new AOL Time Warner. Time Warner's own chief executive, Gerald Levin, was handed the job of running it. The deal closed on January 11, 2001, more than a year after it was announced, and by then, the stock market had already begun repricing the trade downward. The first sign that the money AOL had used to buy this empire was starting to evaporate before the ink was even dry. The logic that drove this deal was not fraud, and it was not incompetence. It was a bet that felt obvious inside the room in January of 2000. AOL's dial-up subscription business was profitable, but it was small compared to its stock price, because the market had decided that anything wearing the label Internet Company deserved future growth priced in today. Case and his board reasoned, correctly, that this valuation was a kind of currency, and that currencies are meant to be spent before they lose value. Time Warner's cable lines were the one thing AOL could not build fast enough on its own, the pipes it needed to survive the coming shift from dial-up to broadband. So AOL spent its stock, all $350 billion of paper value, to buy the actual physical infrastructure and content library it needed to stay relevant for the next decade. The fatal flaw in that logic was timing, not the logic itself. If the internet bubble had kept inflating for even 2 more years, historians might remember this as the smartest trade in media history, a company converting an overpriced stock into hard, cash-generating assets before the market caught on. Instead, the bubble burst within months of the deal closing. AOL's standalone division, valued near $226 billion before the merger, would eventually be written down toward roughly $20 billion. The stock AOL had used as currency turned out to be worth a fraction of what it claimed, but Time Warner's shareholders had already handed over their real company in exchange for it, and there was no way to reverse the trade once it was signed. Almost as soon as the ink dried, the wave hit. The dot-com crash that had already begun rippling through the market in 2000 accelerated through 2001, and internet stocks, AOL's included, lost the majority of their value within months. Inside the newly combined company, the culture clash was immediate and public. Time Warner executives who had spent decades building television networks and movie studios watched their new corporate parent's core division bleed value by the week, and they were furious. Gerald Levin, the man who had championed the deal and taken the CEO job to run it, resigned in December of 2001, barely 11 months after the merger closed. Worn down by shareholders who blamed him directly for handing their real company over for what was rapidly becoming worthless paper, Richard Parsons stepped in to replace him. The following year, Jonathan Miller was installed specifically to run the AOL division on its own, an early sign that the company already understood its two halves were no longer one story. Meanwhile, the wave nobody inside AOL could out-negotiate kept building outside the boardroom entirely. Broadband internet, delivered over exactly the kind of cable lines Time Warner had brought into the deal, was becoming faster, cheaper, and more available every year, and it made AOL's entire business model, a flat monthly fee for a slow dial-up connection, obsolete. AOL's own subscriber charts would later show the decline accelerating sharply from the middle of the decade onward, a slow bleed that no amount of internal reshuffling could stop. The collapse arrived as a single number. On January 30th, 2003, AOL Time Warner reported its full-year results for 2002, a net loss of $98.7 billion, driven by a fourth-quarter charge of $45.5 billion to write down the value of the AOL division specifically. Add up the full year's write-downs, and the company had erased roughly $99 billion of goodwill from its books, a single accounting entry that remains, to this day, the largest goodwill write-down any company in American history has ever recorded. The $98.7 billion net loss was, at the time, the single largest annual loss any American corporation had ever reported. It is important to understand what that number actually meant. The cash had not vanished that year. The cash had vanished 2 years earlier, spent the moment Time Warner's shareholders traded their real company for AOL's stock. The write-down was simply the accounting system, arriving 2 years late, to formally admit what the market had already concluded. The price AOL paid bore no relationship to what AOL was actually worth. On the same day the loss was announced, the company revealed that Ted Turner, the founder of CNN, one of Time Warner's largest individual shareholders, and one of the loudest internal critics of how the merger had gone, was resigning as vice chairman. Later that year, the company quietly dropped the name AOL from its corporate title altogether and went back to simply being Time Warner, as if erasing the word from a letterhead might also erase what had happened underneath it. Contrast what actually happened next with what the deal was supposed to deliver. AOL Time Warner was meant to be the company that proved old media and new media belonged together, that a cable pipe and a chat room and a movie studio could be run as one machine. Instead, the two halves spent the rest of the decade quietly separating again. In 2009, Time Warner spun AOL back out as its own independent public company, trading again on its own under its own ticker, exactly as it had before the merger, only now worth a tiny fraction of what it had been worth the day it walked into the deal. In 2015, Verizon bought that independent AOL outright for $4.4 billion, a company that had once claimed a standalone value near $226 billion. 2 years later, AOL Instant Messenger, the buddy lists and away messages that had defined an entire generation's first experience of texting, was shut down for good after 20 years. By 2021, Verizon sold AOL, bundled together with an equally diminished Yahoo, to a private equity firm for $5 billion total for both companies combined. The empire that once believed its own stock was worth more than CNN, HBO, and Warner Brothers put together had ended up worth less, altogether, than a single mid-sized tech acquisition. The lesson of AOL is not that dial-up lost to broadband, or that old media and new media never really merge well, although both of those things are true. The real lesson is narrower and more uncomfortable. A stock price is not the same thing as value, and a company that starts believing the two are interchangeable will eventually be asked to prove it, usually at the worst possible moment. AOL did not fail because its business was bad. Its dial-up service, at its peak, was one of the most successful consumer subscription products America had ever produced. AOL failed because it treated a temporary, bubble-driven number on a screen as if it were as real and as spendable as cash, and used it to buy something that actually was real before anyone had time to ask whether the math held up. This September, 30 years and change after Steve Case first sold you a disc promising 100 free hours, and only 10 months before this video was made, AOL switched off its dial-up service for the final time. No press conference. No stock price to inflate or protect. Just an old modem somewhere making its last connecting sound and then going quiet. The company that once believed it was worth more than CNN is gone. The sound it made logging on outlived it. If you want to understand how an empire convinces itself that its own hype is a real asset and then bets everything on that belief, this channel exists for exactly that story, told again and again, company after company, Warning after warning. Subscribe if you want the next one when it drops. And down in the comments, tell me this. If you ever burned an AOL disk as a coaster, or sat through the screech of a modem handshake waiting to hear you've got mail, what do you remember most? The sound, the free hours, or the day it all quietly disappeared? I read every one of them, and this is Toppled Empires.